Snow fell quietly, blanketing the forest in a pristine white shroud. Inside a small remote cabin nestled deep in the woods, Ethan Carter sat by a flickering fire. The warmth did little to ease the cold ache in his bones, a feeling he had grown accustomed to over the years. He ran a sharpening stone along the edge of a hunting knife, the rhythmic sound comforting and familiar. Outside, something disturbed the serenity of the forest. A faint crackle of branches snapped Ethan's attention. He paused, his senses sharp as he listened. Years of training and instinct told him that he was no longer alone. He moved to the window, peering through a small gap in the heavy curtains. Dark shapes moved among the trees, shadows flitting through the snow-covered landscape. Ethan's mind raced. He had been in these woods for 5 years, away from the chaos of the city and the ghosts of his past. He had chosen this solitude to heal from wounds that went deeper than flesh. But now, trouble had found him again. He stepped back from the window, careful to keep his movements silent. Memories flooded his mind. The smell of gunpowder, the roar of bullets, the faces of men he had hunted and the partners he had lost. He shook off the thoughts and focused on the present. There were at least 5 figures outside, their approach methodical, their steps almost soundless. Whoever they weren't ordinary hikers. Ethan opened a concealed compartment in the wall, retrieving a handgun and a small radio device. He checked the weapon, ensuring it was loaded and ready. The intruders were getting closer, and he had no intention of being caught off guard. The memories of his last mission with the FBI surfaced again, unbidden. It had been a disaster, one that had ended in betrayal and bloodshed. The choice he had made that day had saved lives but cost him everything: his career, his friends, and his peace of mind. He had walked away, vanishing into the wilderness, hoping to leave it all behind. A sudden noise brought him back to the present. A branch snapped directly outside the cabin. He pressed his back against the wall, listening as heavy boots crunched against the snow. The men were close. He could hear muffled voices speaking in hushed tones. The language was Spanish, and the tone was one he knew well. Cartel. A cold realization settled over him. The cartel was hunting someone, and they were here for answers. He knew that if he didn't act now, he would lose any element of surprise. He moved silently to the back of the cabin, placing his weapons within reach. He extinguished the fire, plunging the room into darkness. The faint glow of moonlight illuminated the silhouettes of the intruders as they surrounded the cabin. A voice, deep and commanding, called out from the shadows. "Sabemos que estás aí. Não faça isso mais difícil para você." Ethan's lips tightened. He knew the game was about to begin, and he was ready for it. He had survived worse, and he wasn't about to let ghosts from his past ruin the peace he had fought so hard to find. Hidden in the shadows, Ethan Carter prepared for what was coming. A storm was on the horizon, and it was only a matter of time before blood was spilled. The cabin's silence was shattered by a loud knock on the door. Ethan remained motionless, his breathing controlled, his body pressed against the wall. The shadows cloaked him, giving him a vantage point to observe the intruders' every move. He could hear them shuffling outside, their impatience growing. "Abre la puerta," demanded the deep voice again. "Sabemos que estás ahí." "No nos hagas entrar por la fuerza." Ethan glanced toward the front entrance, his eyes narrowing as he assessed his options. Acting rashly would get him killed, but waiting too long would give them the upper hand. He took a deep breath, setting the handgun within reach but out of sight. With a steady hand, he stepped out of the shadows, adopting a deliberate slouch as he moved toward the door. He opened it a crack, letting the cold air rush in. "What do you want?" he asked, his voice rough and gravelly, like an old man's. 3 men stood on the porch, their breath clouding in the frigid air. They were dressed in heavy winter coats, but their demeanor betrayed their intent. The man in front, tall with a scar running down his cheek, studied Ethan with suspicion. "Estamos procurando alguém," he said, his eyes narrowing. "Talvez você tenha visto homem que não pertence a este lugar." Ethan forced a nervous chuckle, playing the part of an aging recluse. "There's no one here but me," he replied. "I've been living out here alone for years. You must be mistaken." The scarred man's gaze swept over the cabin's interior. "Podemos dar uma olhada?" he asked. Though it was less of a question and more of a command, Ethan hesitated, feigning nervousness. "There's nothing here for you," he said, his voice shaking. "Just an old man trying to get by." The scarred man stepped forward, his impatience evident. He pushed the door open wide, brushing past Ethan as if he were no more than an obstacle. The two other men followed, their eyes scanning the room with cold efficiency. One of them, a stocky man with a shaved head, exchanged a glance with the scarred leader and nodded. The scarred man's lips curled into a smirk. "Revistem tudo," he ordered. Ethan stepped aside, his hands trembling slightly as the two men began rifling through his belongings. They overturned furniture, opened cabinets, and even peered into the small fireplace. All the while, Ethan remained passive, his posture hunched, his expression one of helplessness. Then, the stocky man paused, his eyes narrowing as he spotted something. The faint outline of a concealed compartment. He knelt, his hand reaching toward it, Ethan's muscles tensed. The time for subterfuge was over. In a blur of movement, he lunged forward, his hand striking the stocky man's throat with pinpoint precision. The man gasped, stumbling back, eyes wide with shock. Ethan didn't give him a chance to recover. He followed up with a brutal elbow to the temple, sending him crashing to the ground. The second man reacted, drawing a weapon, but Ethan was already in motion. He seized the man's arm, twisting it until the gun clattered to the floor. A swift strike to the man's jaw sent him reeling, and Ethan finished him off with a precise kick that left him unconscious. The scarred man was quicker, leveling his own weapon at Ethan's chest. "Basta!" he snarled, his finger tightening on the trigger, but Ethan had anticipated this. He dropped low, sweeping the man's legs out from under him. The gun discharged, the shot echoing through the cabin as it struck harmlessly into the ceiling. Ethan's knife flashed as he pressed it against the man's throat, his expression cold and deadly. "Now," Ethan growled, his voice dropping the old man's pretense. "You're going to tell me who sent you, and you're going to do it fast." The scarred man's eyes flickered with fear, but he forced a smirk. "You think you can stop Hector Ramirez? He'll burn this place to the ground just to watch you die." Ethan's grip tightened, his jaw clenching. "Then I'll make sure he regrets that choice." The scarred man's defiance faltered, and for a brief moment he looked like a man who knew he'd made a fatal mistake. Ethan's eyes hardened. "You've picked the wrong target." Ethan pressed the blade harder against the scarred man's throat, feeling the pulse of fear beneath his hand. "How many more?" he demanded, his voice calm and controlled. The man swallowed, eyes flickering with desperation. "There are 5 more," he admitted. "They're circling the cabin. You can't escape. You'll be dead by dawn." A bitter smile twisted Ethan's lips. "I've heard that before." With a swift motion, he delivered a precise strike to the man's temple, rendering him unconscious. He stepped over the bodies, gathering his weapons and supplies with practiced efficiency. There was no time to waste. He moved to the back door, easing it open just enough to peer into the snowy night. Shadows moved between the trees, their movements deliberate and calculated. Ethan knew that staying inside was a death sentence. He needed to disappear into the forest, where he could use his surroundings to his advantage. Slipping out into the frigid air, Ethan's breath puffed out in a steady rhythm. He kept low, his movements silent as he made his way deeper into the woods. Snow crunched faintly beneath his boots, and he took care to stay out of sight, weaving between tree trunks and jagged rocks. As he moved, memories clawed their way to the surface, the mission that had changed everything. He remembered the faces of his team, the scent of gunpowder hanging in the air, the feeling of betrayal when the informant they had trusted led them into a deadly ambush. He could still hear the echoes of gunfire, the screams of his partners as they fell around him. He shook off the memories, focusing on the present. He had chosen this life of solitude to escape those ghosts, but it seemed that no matter how far he ran, they would always find him. A faint rustling brought him to a halt. He pressed his back against a tree, scanning the darkness. One of the cartel members was moving through the woods, his weapon raised as he searched for any sign of movement. The man's breath was ragged, his eyes darting nervously. Ethan's gaze narrowed. He moved like a shadow, circling around behind the man, his footsteps silent. He closed the distance in an instant, clamping a hand over the man's mouth as he drove his knife into his side. The man went limp, and Ethan lowered him to the ground without a sound. He knew it was only a matter of time before the others discovered their fallen comrades. He needed to stay one step ahead, using his knowledge of the terrain to outmaneuver them. As he moved deeper into the forest, flashes of his past surfaced once more. The final moments of that disastrous mission replayed in his mind. The gun pressed against his head, the cold eyes of the cartel leader who had betrayed them, and the decision he had made to walk away from everything he had known, to disappear and start over. A faint glow flickered through the trees ahead. Ethan's heart quickened as he approached, recognizing it as a small makeshift campsite. The cartel was closing in, and they had set up a temporary base of operations. He observed from the shadows, listening to their conversation. They spoke of Hector Ramirez's orders, of the relentless pursuit of a traitor who had betrayed the cartel's trust. Ethan's eyes narrowed. Whoever they were looking for, they were willing to burn down everything in their path to find him. A faint crackle of static interrupted the conversation, followed by a familiar voice. Ethan's heart skipped a beat. It was Jack Donovan, his old FBI partner. "Ethan, if you're out there, I know you think you're alone, but you're not. We need to talk. It's important." Ethan took a deep breath, his mind racing. Jack's voice was a reminder of the life he had left behind, of the man he had once been. He knew that contacting Jack would be a risk, but he also knew that if the cartel was this determined, he couldn't face them alone. Ethan melted back into the shadows, disappearing into the forest as the cartel's men continued their search. He would need to use every skill he had ever learned if he hoped to survive the night, and he would need answers that only Jack Donovan could provide. The crackling of a campfire echoed through the cold night air as Hector Ramirez stood at the edge of the makeshift campsite. His piercing eyes scanned the darkness, frustration evident on his face. Hector was a man of reputation, known for his ruthless leadership and unforgiving nature. Failure was not something he tolerated, and tonight his patience had run thin. The remnants of the failed attack on the cabin were scattered before him. Broken weapons, bloodied footprints, and the unmistakable signs of a struggle. He clenched his fists, anger simmering beneath the surface. "Idiotas," he muttered, turning to his second-in-command, a wiry man named Vargas. "You mean to tell me that an old man did this?" Vargas swallowed hard, his eyes darting nervously. "Senor, we underestimated him. He's not just some recluse. Whoever he is, he's dangerous." Hector's expression darkened. "I want this man found. No more mistakes. Spread out and search every inch of this forest. I don't care if you have to burn it to the ground. Bring me his head." Vargas nodded quickly, shouting orders to the rest of the men. They fanned out, weapons drawn, their determination renewed by the fear of Hector's wrath. The forest became alive with movement as they hunted their elusive prey. Unbeknownst to them, Ethan watched from a ridge above, his eyes fixed on Hector's imposing figure. He studied the man, noting the confident way he moved, the aura of authority that surrounded him. This was no ordinary leader. This was a predator, and Ethan knew that facing him would be the greatest challenge yet. He moved quietly, slipping further into the forest to prepare for what was coming. The cabin had been compromised, and the cartel's presence was only growing stronger. He needed to set traps, create diversions, and use the terrain to his advantage. Hours passed as Ethan worked with precision. He set tripwires, rigged branches to fall, and scattered false trails to mislead the search parties. He worked tirelessly, his mind sharp and focused, blocking out the cold and the exhaustion that tugged at him. At dawn, a fresh wave of cartel assassins arrived, their faces hard and cold. Hector addressed them with the ruthless conviction of a man who refused to be denied. "We're dealing with a professional," he said, his voice carrying through the air. "Do not underestimate him. He's out there, and he's watching us. Stay alert." As Hector's men dispersed, Ethan watched from a hidden vantage point, his breath steady. He knew the terrain better than they did. He knew how to disappear, how to move undetected. But he also knew that Hector was relentless, and that meant this would only end in blood. He tightened his grip on his weapon, adrenaline surging through him. He had faced ruthless criminals before, men who thought they were untouchable. But Hector Ramirez was different. He was calculated, patient, and he was determined to see Ethan dead. Ethan's thoughts drifted briefly to Jack Donovan's voice on the radio. He knew he needed to find a way to contact Jack, to understand why he was being hunted so relentlessly. There was more to this than a simple manhunt, and he needed answers. Suddenly, a faint noise behind him made him turn. One of Hector's men had broken off from the group, his eyes scanning the ridge where Ethan lay hidden. The man's footsteps crunched on the snow, moving closer and closer. Ethan's muscles coiled, ready to strike. He waited, his patience unwavering, until the man was within reach. In a flash, Ethan stepped out of the shadows, his movements swift and deadly. He silenced the man with a precise chokehold, lowering him to the ground without a sound. He took the man's radio, listening in on the cartel's chatter. Hector's voice crackled through the device. If he's not found by nightfall, we'll make this forest a graveyard. I want him dead." Ethan's jaw tightened. He knew that Hector wasn't making an empty threat. The forest was about to become a war zone, and he was standing at the center of it. With a final glance toward the campsite below, Ethan slipped back into the shadows, ready for whatever came next. Dawn's pale light filtered through the trees, casting long shadows over the snowy forest. Ethan moved with precision, weaving through the dense landscape as he made his way to a hidden location known only to him, a small cave that provided temporary shelter. He needed to gather his thoughts and find a way to contact Jack Donovan. As he slipped into the cave, the faint glow of a fire caught his attention. Instinctively, he raised his weapon, moving silently toward the source. His grip tightened when he saw a familiar face sitting by the fire. A man with short, graying hair and a weathered look that spoke of a life spent in dangerous places. "Jack," Ethan said, his voice low but steady. Jack Donovan looked up, a faint smile crossing his lips. "Took you long enough, Carter. I was starting to think you'd forgotten how to find me." Ethan lowered his weapon, a mix of relief and tension coursing through him. "What are you doing here? You know how dangerous this place is." Jack leaned back, warming his hands by the fire. "Dangerous? That's an understatement. Hector's men are everywhere, but I'm not here by accident. We need to talk." Ethan settled onto a rock across from him, his expression hardening. "Talk fast. The cartel isn't going to give us much time." Jack's eyes narrowed. "You've been off the grid for years, but they still found you. Hector Ramirez isn't just after you because you're in his territory. This goes deeper, Ethan. It's about something that happened before you disappeared." Ethan's jaw tightened. "The mission, the betrayal, what else could it be?" Jack shook his head. "It's more than that. Hector's been working with someone from the FBI. There's a mole and they've been feeding him information. He's not just after a traitor in his cartel. He's after the man who destroyed his entire operation 5 years ago. That man is you." Ethan's breath stilled. The weight of Jack's words sank in. "A mole? Someone I trusted?" Jack nodded. "That's right. Hector's been obsessed with revenge. He wants to take you down, and he's not going to stop until he does." A cold fury burned in Ethan's chest. He had sacrificed everything to protect innocent lives during that mission, and now the ghosts of that past were closing in on him. "Who's the mole?" he demanded, his voice low. Jack's expression darkened. "I'm not sure yet, but I have leads. I know it's someone high up, someone who wants to erase all evidence of that mission, including you." The two men sat in silence for a moment, the weight of the revelations settling over them. Finally, Ethan spoke. "We need a plan. Hector's got an army out there and he's not going to stop." Jack's lips curled into a smirk. "Good thing I brought backup. I called in a few favors." "We're not entirely outnumbered." Ethan raised an eyebrow. "What kind of backup?" Jack gestured toward the mouth of the cave. Two figures stepped out from the shadows, both former FBI agents, both men Ethan recognized immediately. There was a flicker of relief as he saw their faces. These were men he could trust. "Looks like old times, huh?" one of them said, a grin playing at the corner of his lips. Ethan allowed himself a rare smile. "Let's hope we still remember how to do this." Jack leaned forward, his voice serious. "First, we make Hector believe he's got the upper hand. Then, we turn the tables on him. We'll lure him into a trap, and we'll make him pay for what he's done." Ethan's eyes hardened. "This ends tonight. No more running. No more ghosts." Jack extended a hand, and Ethan grasped it firmly. "Then let's finish what we started." Outside, the forest was coming alive with the sound of Hector's men drawing closer. The time for hiding was over. It was time for war. Ethan, Jack, and the two former FBI agents moved with precision through the forest. The morning air was crisp and biting, but adrenaline coursed through their veins, numbing them to the cold. They had a plan, a dangerous one that required perfect execution. "All right," Jack whispered, crouching low as he surveyed the enemy's positions. "Hector's men are fanning out, trying to close the circle around us. We'll use that to our advantage." Ethan nodded. "We create chaos, break their formation, and draw them into a choke point. Once they're separated, we strike hard and fast." One of the former agents, a wiry man named Brooks, adjusted his grip on his rifle. "We'll hit them in waves. They won't know what hit them." Jack's gaze flicked to Ethan. "You ready for this?" Ethan's expression was cold and resolute. "I've been ready for this since they knocked on my door." They split into two teams, moving silently through the undergrowth. Ethan and Jack took the left flank, while Brooks and the other agent, Monroe, circled to the right. The forest seemed to hold its breath, as if it sensed the violence that was about to unfold. It began with a whisper, a faint rustle that drew the attention of two cartel members. Ethan and Jack pounced, striking with lethal precision. The men fell silently, their weapons confiscated and hidden away. The plan was simple: neutralize quietly until chaos erupted. Brooks and Monroe initiated the next step, using smoke grenades to create confusion. Plumes of thick gray smoke curled up from the trees, obscuring vision and disrupting Hector's carefully organized search pattern. Shouts of alarm echoed through the forest. "Están aquí! Encuéntrenlos!" Hector's furious voice cut through the chaos, urging his men to move faster. Ethan moved through the smoke like a ghost, taking down one enemy after another. Every action was efficient, calculated. Years of training brought to bear against those who threatened his life. Jack, his movements equally fluid, caught a glimpse of Hector's silhouette in the distance. "There he is," he hissed to Ethan. "He's the key. We take him down, the rest will crumble." Ethan nodded, his eyes narrowing. "We draw him into the trap." Vargas, Hector's second-in-command, shouted orders. "Secure the perimeter. No one leaves this forest alive." Ethan's mind raced. Vargas was a loose thread, someone who needed to be eliminated. He whispered to Jack, "I'll take Vargas. You focus on luring Hector." Jack's face tightened. "Watch yourself." Ethan moved like a shadow, slipping through the chaos until he found Vargas barking orders into a radio. Ethan took his shot, silent and precise. Vargas collapsed, the radio slipping from his grasp. "Vargas?" Hector's voice crackled through the radio, anger simmering beneath the surface. "Where are you?" Ethan lifted the radio, masking his voice with a chilling calmness. "He's not here anymore, Hector." There was a moment of silence, then Hector's voice came through, deadly and cold. "You think you can hide? I'm coming for you, Ethan Carter." Ethan smiled grimly. "I'll be waiting." He dropped the radio and signaled to Jack. The trap was set. Hector would come for him, and when he did, Ethan and his team would be ready. An hour later, the forest was eerily quiet. The bodies of Hector's men lay scattered among the trees, the snow stained crimson. Hector stepped into the clearing, his eyes cold and determined. He held his weapon with practiced ease, scanning the area for signs of movement. "Come out, Carter," he called, his voice echoing through the trees. "Face me like a man." Ethan emerged from the shadows, his expression calm and resolute. "You've been hunting me, Hector. Now it's your turn to run." Hector's lips twisted into a sneer. "You can't stop me. You're just one man." Ethan's gaze was icy. "Not today. You walked into my territory, and now you'll pay the price." Jack, Brooks, and Monroe stepped out from the trees, their weapons trained on Hector. The cartel leader's confidence wavered for a split second, but he quickly recovered, his jaw tightening in defiance. "You think this is over?" Hector spat. "You've made a mistake, Carter. You can't kill a ghost." Ethan took a step forward, his expression hard. "I'm not trying to kill a ghost, I'm putting an end to a nightmare." As Hector's men began to regroup, the air crackled with tension. The final confrontation was coming, and the forest held its breath once more. The forest grew silent, a heavy, almost suffocating stillness settling over the snow-covered ground. Hector stood in the clearing, his cold gaze fixed on Ethan and his team. His men, scattered and disorganized, began to regroup, forming a loose circle around their leader. Ethan's heartbeat was steady, his breath even. He knew that the coming battle would determine everything. He met Hector's gaze, unflinching. "This is your last chance, Hector. Walk away. You and your men leave this forest, and you might live to see another day." Hector's lips twisted into a cruel smile. "You still think you can win? I have more men on the way. You can't stop me." Jack stepped forward, his rifle trained on Hector. "You don't get it, do you? You're the one who walked into a trap." Hector's eyes flickered with doubt for the briefest of moments, but he quickly hid it behind a mask of cold confidence. "Enough talk. Let's finish this." Ethan's eyes narrowed. "We're not going to fight you head-on. You don't deserve that honor." He raised his hand, signaling the beginning of their strategy. From the trees above, a series of traps were triggered. Logs rolled down slopes, taking out groups of cartel members who had unknowingly walked into prepared ambush points. Hidden explosives detonated, sending snow and debris into the air, creating confusion and chaos. The cartel's formation collapsed, their unity shattered. Hector barked orders, his voice filled with anger. "Rea grupen! Não deixem eles escapar." Jack and Monroe took advantage of the chaos, picking off Hector's men one by one. Brooks moved through the undergrowth, providing cover fire and maintaining a perimeter. Ethan's focus remained on Hector. He knew that taking down the leader was the only way to break the cartel's resolve. He moved quickly, using the terrain to his advantage, closing the distance between himself and Hector. Hector spotted him and opened fire, bullets chipping away at trees and sending shards of bark flying through the air. Ethan ducked and weaved, moving closer until he was within striking distance. He lunged forward, knocking the weapon from Hector's hands. The two men grappled, their movements swift and brutal. Hector's strength was formidable, but Ethan's training and determination gave him the edge. He slammed Hector against a tree, his forearm pressing against the cartel leader's throat. "You made a mistake coming here," Ethan growled. "This isn't your territory." Hector sneered, his eyes burning with defiance. "I'm not the only one hunting you. You think you're safe just because you're in these woods? You're wrong." Ethan's grip tightened. "Who's working with you? Who's the mole in the FBI?" Hector let out a harsh laugh. "You'll never find out. Even if I die, the wheels are already in motion. You're a dead man walking, Carter." Ethan's jaw clenched, but before he could press further, a sudden burst of gunfire forced him to break contact. He dove for cover as Hector's remaining men unleashed a desperate assault. "Jack!" Ethan shouted. "We need to end this now," Jack's voice echoed back. "We're running out of time. We can't hold them off much longer." Ethan's mind raced. He knew that brute force wasn't the answer. They needed to outsmart Hector to use his arrogance against him. He signaled to Jack, who nodded in understanding. They moved into position, leading Hector's men into a narrow ravine that Ethan had scouted earlier. The ground was unstable, a perfect place to set a trap. Hector's men pursued, driven by orders and fear. As they reached the narrow passage, Ethan triggered a final explosive charge. The ground beneath the cartel members gave way, sending them tumbling into the ravine below. Hector's eyes widened as he saw his men fall, his expression twisted with rage. "This isn't over." Ethan stepped forward, his eyes cold. "It is for you. Surrender, Hector, or face the consequences." Hector raised his hands slowly, his expression one of cold resignation. "You're good, Carter, but you're still just one man." Ethan exchanged a glance with Jack. "We're more than that. We're the ones who stop men like you." The air was thick with tension, and Ethan knew that the final confrontation was imminent. Hector was cornered, but a man like him wouldn't go down without a fight. The battle was coming, and Ethan was prepared to finish it once and for all. The air in the forest was thick with tension. The remnants of Hector's men lay scattered across the ravine, and the forest echoed with the soft crunch of snow beneath boots as Ethan, Jack, and their team moved carefully toward Hector. The cartel leader had surrendered, but Ethan knew better than to trust the man's submission. He could still feel the anger and the fire simmering beneath Hector's steely exterior. Ethan stepped forward, his eyes never leaving Hector. The cartel leader stood with his hands raised, but there was no sign of defeat in his eyes. Instead, there was a cold resolve, as if he had already accepted his fate and was waiting for the right moment to strike. "You think this is over?" Hector spat, his voice dripping with venom. "You have no idea what you've started, Carter. You've no idea how deep this goes." Ethan narrowed his gaze, his pulse steady as he assessed the situation. "Tell me, who's behind it all? Who's pulling the strings?" Hector's eyes flickered for just a moment, but he quickly regained his composure. "You really think it was just about a betrayal? About your little mission?" "No, Carter, you're nothing more than a pawn in a game much bigger than you realize." Ethan's breath quickened, a mixture of confusion and anger building in his chest. "A pawn? What game are you talking about?" Hector smirked, his eyes gleaming with something dangerous. "The FBI's been corrupted. The higher-ups, they've been working with the cartels for years. They didn't just send you to infiltrate. They sent you to fail, to cover up the truth. That's why you've been running. The people you thought you could trust, they sold you out, and now they're coming for you. They've been watching you, waiting for you to slip." The ground beneath Ethan's feet seemed to shift. His mind raced, struggling to process what Hector was saying. "You're lying." Hector's smile was slow and cruel. "You've been the perfect soldier, Carter, the perfect distraction. But you're not the one they're really after. They never wanted to take you down. They wanted to make sure no one would ever learn the truth. And now you're a threat. The FBI, the cartel, they've all been working together, controlling everything from the shadows." Ethan's world seemed to shatter in an instant. The very people he had sworn to protect, those he had trusted, fought alongside, had betrayed him. The mission, the friends he had lost, the choices he had made, it had all been part of a far more sinister game. The truth hit him like a punch to the gut. His entire life had been manipulated. His past nothing more than a series of carefully orchestrated events designed to keep him in the dark. Jack stepped forward, his voice steady. "Is this true, Ethan? What he's saying?" Ethan couldn't answer at first. His mind was still reeling, trying to process the enormity of Hector's words. I don't know," he finally admitted, his voice shaky. "But if it's true, then everything I've done, every sacrifice, and has been for nothing." Hector's laughter was bitter, mocking. "For nothing? No, Carter. It was never about you. You were just the tool. And now you're dangerous because you know too much." Ethan's fist clenched, the weight of the revelation threatening to crush him. But as the anger boiled inside him, a new clarity emerged. He couldn't let Hector win. He couldn't let the people who had betrayed him escape justice. "You're wrong," Ethan said, his voice cold and resolved. "I may have been a pawn, but I'm done playing the game. And I'm not letting you, or anyone else, get away with it." Hector's eyes flashed with something darker, a hint of desperation in his gaze. "You're too late, Carter. Even if you kill me, it won't change a thing. The truth is buried, and there's no one left to stop it." Ethan's hand tightened around his weapon, but before he could act, Jack's voice stopped him. "Ethan, we can't let him manipulate us. He's just trying to get into your head. We've come this far. We finish this." The weight of the decision settled on Ethan's shoulders. He could kill Hector, end the threat, but would it really be enough? The truth was bigger than Hector. It was bigger than the cartel. If what Hector said was true, there were people out there who would continue the fight, continue the manipulation. The battle wouldn't end with Hector's death. It would be a war that would rage on. Ethan's mind flashed back to the mission, to the faces of the men he had trusted. Could he ever truly escape the past? Was there even a place for peace in his life anymore? The choice was before him: justice, revenge, or the pursuit of truth. And as he stood over Hector, Ethan Carter knew that whatever decision he made, it would shape the rest of his life. The cold air seemed to freeze in place as Ethan stood over Hector, his weapon drawn, his pulse steady. Every fiber of his being screamed to end this now, to stop the man who had been the source of so much pain. But something held him back, a flicker of doubt that gnawed at the edges of his thoughts. Hector was right about one thing: the truth was out there, and it was bigger than them both. But Ethan couldn't think about that now. He couldn't afford to be paralyzed by uncertainty. Hector was a threat, one that needed to be eradicated for good. He had to finish what he started. Hector, sensing the hesitation, smirked. "Still hesitating, Carter? What's it going to be, the gun or your conscience?" Ethan's grip on the weapon tightened. The years of training, the countless lives he had taken in the name of justice, had led to this moment. He had never faltered before, never allowed his emotions to cloud his judgment. But now, as he looked down at the cartel leader who had caused so much destruction, he felt the weight of every decision he had ever made. Jack's voice broke through the silence. "Ethan, don't let him win. You've already lost too much to let him get to you now." Ethan's gaze flicked to Jack, and for a brief moment, he saw the man who had stood by him in the darkest of times. They had been through hell together, and Jack understood what it took to survive. "Finish it," Jack said quietly, but with unwavering conviction. "For us. For everything you've fought for." The words hit Ethan like a slap, snapping him out of his hesitation. He couldn't afford to think about the past anymore. The man in front of him was the enemy, the symbol of everything that had gone wrong. The future was uncertain, but this fight, this battle, was all he could control. Ethan's finger tightened on the trigger, the gun steady in his hands. He moved, fast as lightning, closing the gap between them. Hector raised his hand, but it was too late. Ethan's fist collided with Hector's jaw, knocking the cartel leader back with brutal force. The sound of the punch echoed through the still air. Hector stumbled, momentarily dazed, but his rage fueled him. He lunged at Ethan, slamming into him with the force of a freight train. The two men grappled, rolling across the snow, each struggling for dominance. Ethan's mind raced as he fought to keep Hector under control. This was more than just a physical battle. It was a battle for everything he had ever known, for the man he used to be, for the man he could still become. Hector's breath came in ragged gasps, his hands trying to find purchase around Ethan's throat. The cartel leader was strong, his movements vicious, but Ethan was faster, his training kicking in as he pushed Hector off and flipped him onto his back. For a brief moment, Hector gasped for air, his eyes filled with venom. "You're nothing, Carter. Just a man lost in the woods pretending to be something more." Ethan's hands tightened around Hector's throat, squeezing the life out of him. But as his vision blurred with the sound of Hector's strangled breath, a voice inside him screamed for him to stop. Ethan wavered, his grip loosening for a split second, and in that moment, Hector used his last ounce of strength to twist free, bringing his knee up to drive into Ethan's ribs. The air exploded from Ethan's lungs, and he staggered back, gasping for breath. But even as the pain surged through him, Ethan knew this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Hector took a step back, eyes burning with hatred. "You should have killed me when you had the chance," he hissed. Ethan's eyes narrowed, his stance firm. "I'm not going to kill you, Hector, not yet. You're going to answer for everything you've done, and when I'm done with you, you'll be nothing." Hector laughed, though it was more of a cough than a chuckle. "You think you've won? You've played into their hands, Carter. The FBI, the cartel, they've been controlling you from the start. This is just a small piece of the puzzle. You'll never escape." Ethan stood tall, his breath steadying. He was done with the games. The truth could wait. The fight, however, was far from over. "Maybe," Ethan said, his voice cold and certain, "but you'll never be the one to finish this." With a single, final step forward, Ethan prepared for what came next. Ethan stood poised, his body aching from the brutal exchange, but his resolve hard as stone. Hector's taunts and threats no longer had power over him. For all the pain, the betrayal, the manipulation, Ethan Carter had fought too long and too hard to let this man, this monster, have the final say. Hector, though injured and bleeding, still exuded a quiet confidence. He had survived countless battles, and in his mind, this was just another hurdle. "You really think you can defeat me?" Hector spat, wiping blood from his lip. "I am Hector Ramirez. You can kill me, but someone else will rise in my place. It's inevitable." Ethan's expression hardened. "You're right about one thing. There will always be someone else, but it won't be you. You'll be the last of your kind." The words cut through the tension like a blade. Hector narrowed his eyes, sizing Ethan up. He didn't believe it. How could one man, battered and outnumbered, defeat the very empire he had built? But what Hector failed to see was that Ethan wasn't fighting alone anymore. From the shadows, Jack and the others had positioned themselves perfectly. The final phase of their plan was in motion. As Hector turned to assess his remaining forces, Ethan moved, swift and determined. In the span of a heartbeat, Hector's expression shifted from arrogance to alarm. He had just enough time to realize that his men were either dead or incapacitated. The forest, once their advantage, had now become their grave. Jack's voice cut through the silence. "He's yours, Ethan." Ethan's eyes flicked to Jack, then back to Hector. This wasn't just about revenge, it was about stopping the machine Hector represented. The corruption, the manipulation, the power that had poisoned the world Ethan once knew. Ethan wasn't just fighting for his life anymore, he was fighting for the future. Hector, now realizing the trap had been sprung and there was no way out, lunged forward trying to regain control. But Ethan was faster. He sidestepped Hector's charge, spinning on his heels to deliver a crushing blow to Hector's midsection. The force of the impact sent Hector stumbling backward, gasping for air. Before Hector could recover, Ethan grabbed him by the collar, slamming him against a tree. The force was enough to knock the breath from Hector's lungs, and he struggled to keep his feet beneath him. "You're finished, Hector," Ethan said, his voice low and steady. "You've been living in the shadows for far too long thinking you're untouchable, but nothing lasts forever." Hector's eyes burned with rage, but there was a flicker of something else, something akin to fear. He had never been in this position before. He was always the one pulling the strings, always the one in control. But now, in the face of a relentless enemy, he had nothing left. His empire was crumbling, his power slipping away. "You don't know what you're dealing with," Hector gritted, his breath coming in ragged gasps. "This isn't the end. The truth will come out, and when it does, you'll regret everything. You'll regret leaving me alive." Ethan's grip tightened. "The truth has already come out, and I'm not letting you get away with it." With one swift motion, Ethan disarmed Hector, taking his weapon and throwing it aside. He stepped closer, staring Hector down, making sure the cartel leader understood the finality of the situation. The truth was no longer hidden. The game was up. "You don't get to escape justice," Ethan said firmly. Hector's eyes flashed with defiance. "You think this is over, Carter? You think you've won? You have no idea what's coming. The people I work for, they'll never find you." Ethan interrupted, his voice cutting through Hector's words like a knife. "Because you're going to disappear. And if I have to bury every trace of you, I will." Hector's smug expression faltered, his confidence evaporating as the weight of Ethan's words settled in. He had underestimated Ethan. Again, the old man, the man who had been cast aside, who had no more allegiance to anyone, had become the greatest threat to everything Hector had built. And now, Hector was trapped, cornered by his own ambition. With a final controlled motion, Ethan forced Hector to the ground. The forest around them seemed to hold its breath, the tension building to a peak. Jack and the team stood ready, their weapons trained on Hector and any surviving cartel members, ensuring no one would escape. Ethan turned to Jack, his face expressionless. "It's done." Jack nodded, his eyes showing a mixture of relief and respect. "It is." As Hector lay on the ground, his power fading like the last embers of a dying fire, Ethan looked down at him. The battle had been fierce, but the war was far from over. There was still much to be done. The truth, Hector had claimed, would come to light. But Ethan knew it wasn't over for him yet. The price of justice was high and the road to redemption was a long one. And yet, for the first time in years, Ethan felt like he could breathe again. The forest fell into an eerie stillness as the finality of the moment settled over the scene. Ethan stood over Hector, his chest rising and falling with the weight of the fight he had just endured. His body was battered, his clothes torn, but his mind was clearer than it had been in years. The war with Hector Ramirez was over, but the war within him was far from finished. Jack approached cautiously, his expression unreadable but filled with a quiet understanding. "You did what you had to do," he said, his voice low. No one else could have stopped him. Ethan didn't respond immediately. He stood there watching the last remnants of the cartel's power crumble. The trees around him, now scattered with the remnants of violence, seemed to echo the silence of his own thoughts. For so long he had been running from the past, running from the choices he had made. But today, the past had caught up to him in ways he hadn't expected. The sounds of distant sirens were a reminder that the authorities were closing in, but Ethan didn't care. He had played his part. He had brought down a criminal empire. He had stopped the man who would have continued to wreak havoc on the world. But the real battle was in his own heart. "What happens now?" Jack asked, sensing the depth of Ethan's uncertainty. Ethan turned away, his gaze distant. "I don't know. I've been fighting ghosts for so long. I don't know what comes next. But I'm done running." Jack placed a hand on his shoulder, offering what little comfort he could. "You don't have to run anymore. The world needs men like you, Ethan. You've proven that." Ethan didn't say anything, but the faintest flicker of gratitude passed through his eyes. For the first time in years, he felt something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in a long time. Hope. The weight of the past wasn't gone, but it was lighter now. Maybe the redemption he had been seeking wasn't about escaping the past. Maybe it was about finding peace with it. A crackle of radio static interrupted the silence. It was one of the FBI agents, confirming that the authorities were closing in on the site. "Everything's secure, Ethan. You can disappear now. We'll handle it from here." Ethan glanced at Jack, then back toward the trees. He had been a part of the FBI once, had been a soldier in their fight against organized crime. But that life was over. He had already walked away once, and now, for good, it was time to disappear again. "Good luck," Jack said, his voice sincere. Ethan nodded, giving his old partner a brief but meaningful glance. "You too." With that, Ethan turned and disappeared into the forest, blending into the shadows as he had done countless times before. He knew that the world wouldn't remember his name. He didn't need it to. This was the final chapter of his story, the end of a long and painful journey. But even as he vanished into the trees, something had changed. Ethan Carter, the man who had once been broken, now had the power to shape his own future. And though the past would always be a part of him, he was no longer defined by it. The world was vast, full of possibilities he had long forgotten. And for the first time, Ethan was ready to face whatever came next. The sun began to rise, casting a soft glow over the forest, and Ethan walked forward, the shadows of the past behind him, and the future open before him.